Uh, Keshav has recently retired from the career from Indian Administrative Services, and he was the health secretary. After that, he has been working with several non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, and recently has been in news, especially in the health sector, for his book. I was telling him I don't agree with the title of that, but it's an excellent book. Uh, Healers or Predators.
It's not a book I wrote. I was one of
Edited.
3 co-editors.
He's one of the editors of that, Healers or Predators. I don't agree with that predator part of it, but it's an excellent book on corruption in the health sector. Our second panelist is Nandini Sundar. Please come. She has studied in Oxford and Columbia University and is currently a professor in Delhi School of Economics. She is a sociologist by training, and she is practicing sociologist. Her work has largely been in Bastar. I think for her PhD she started working in Bastar, and then she has been visiting that area for a very long time, and she understands the issues of the people there. She has worked a lot about the issue of salvagedom and has fought cases against that, and the whole history of that atrocities on the people was because of her work in Bastar. One of my friend actually recently gave her chapter in one of her books on Iravati Karve as an anthropologist. So she has studied a lot about the anthropology in Maharashtra also. So that was an interesting thing to understand about her. But we'll come to know about them as we talk. Our third panelist is Usha Ramanathan, who is, please come Usha. She has a background of law, but is not a practicing lawyer. I understand, or is it? No. She is basically works on jurisprudence of law, poverty and rights. She researches rights and speaks on issues that include the nature of law, Bhopal gas disaster, mass displacements. Of late, if we are reading, quite often she has been writing on issue of Aadhaar and surveillance kind of thing, which is coming on our citizens, and about several other things. Her work draws heavily upon non-governmental experience in its encounters with the state, and that's why we have invited her along with the others, because that's the issue of one of the contentious issues we would be discussing today, like what would be the interface and what would be the kind of cooperation and not cooperation, but what would be the fights and kind of things on both sides, state and the society. She has been speaking at several places, and again she has been part of the planning commission in the past also. So we have now 3 eminent people on our panel, and if you wanted, these are the copies of the questions you asked for. So the structure of the discussion today would be, after this introduction, I would request 3 of them to talk each about 8 to 10 minutes each about their own perspective about this subject, because I don't want to start off right away with questions and answers. So one thing before I ask them to open up is, we would like to also have this understanding, because if we restrict ourselves to civil society organizations and policy and discourse, I think maybe before that we would like to understand what do we mean by civil society, because are we restricting ourselves to civil society organizations and NGOs only and their interaction with the state, or for that matter, civil society comprises of so many things, and it could be labor unions, it could be people's movements, it could be individual researchers who are working in the institutions, it could be academics, which is not a part of the government but would be interacting with the government. So anything that interacts with the government on policies, shall we define that as a civil society and discuss about that? And we had some discussion about that while we were coming to this venue. So that's the background. And second thing is, what's the role in the current situation or the political situation about the role of civil society organizations? And there could be, because all of them have a long experience of working in this field. So maybe the historical perspective also, like, has it really changed? Because when the civil society actually confronts the government or the state, there would always be some kind of a fight back. And are we getting more of a regulation, or was it the same all throughout, or was there any better place when there was a more role for a civil society organizations, or are we seeing there could be a better place and better ways to have this space occupied by the civil society organizations? These are my opening thoughts before I hand over to you. And I think we will go the same way. Keshav, you can start.
We agreed amongst ourselves that Usha would start.
Okay.
Amongst? Okay, that ourselves didn't include me.
You are my
Oh, yeah. Ask Nandini. We agreed.
So this is another version of majoritarian politics that you're seeing here. And as the vulnerable and weak one, I shall have to succumb. Okay, I was actually thinking I wouldn't dare try and answer that question of civil society and what it is. So I won't even try. But I think there are various ways of looking at this. And maybe just as an exploration, if I were to start with thinking about, say, the past 70 years, what has happened in terms of how our thinking and work in dealing with the kind of issues that have arisen around us, how has that moved? I'm sure each of us has everyone here is experienced, so each of us will have different points that we see as watersheds, different points that we see as times when something dramatic changed. So I'm only going to say what mine was. So if I'm thinking I'll take it from 1950. 50s and 60s seem to have been a far greater time when they say that the Narmada Dam was decided in 1961 and they laid the foundation stone then. If we periodize it, maybe we won't, the idea of dams as the temples of modern India becomes completely, it's obnoxious. But in 1961, it may not have been as obnoxious because we didn't have the experience that we've had since. So the idea of a kind of at least the way I see it is that soon after 1947, in the 1950s, 60s, we were among the first countries to get decolonized, and we didn't have anything for survival. For subsistence, for self-reliance. So the 50s and 60s are times when everybody was willing to put shoulder to wheel. You left a lot on the state. The state did a lot of the planning. And there were some things that went right, some things that may not have been good decisions, which we needed to review and change some directions and perhaps retain others. So that's a time where, when you read Shripad's report on Bakra, people gave up their land because they thought they were doing it for the state. It was an endeavor in which everyone was involved. Nobody expected really to be left behind. The idea was that everyone will be part of it. And it seems to have been about 15 years before it became obvious that there is a process of marginalization that this kind of development project brings. And that's when you start, a different kind of consciousness begins. But to me, the watershed moment, politically there were a number of things that were happening which changed the view of the state and of the kind of idealism that the state should have represented, and we could have hoped it will continue to represent. That changed in the late 60s. But the critical moment, I think, when I see it, it's the emergency. And the emergency was important because it did a number of things. But before I go to that, I think, when we were talking to Hargopal recently, he was saying that we were discussing why there is anti-incumbency every time. Why is it that governments get thrown out, others get brought in every time? What is the problem? And he was saying that, when we were saying that in the late 60s, 70s, that's about the time you find that many of the promises of what this country would become and how everybody would be a part of it and everyone would find something that would take them far away from where they were into better times. That kind of aspiration that was created didn't match the kind of performance that a state found possible. And maybe many of the promises that keep getting made, especially electoral promises that keep getting made, cannot be attained. And it's promises that are being made more to take, more to evoke some kind of sentiment among the people during a period of elections or whatever, which cannot be realized. So there is that lack of enchantment of the state that starts setting in, and the emergency completely killed it. With the emergency, we knew that the state was saying that power is more important than anything else, and that it's fine, the state begins to feel threatened by a citizenry. So it's not about the state protecting the interests of the people, but of the people becoming a threat to the state. Then it's a kind of adversarial relationship that gets set up. And ever since, it's been an uncomfortable, an uneasy relationship between the state and the people. And the idea of sovereignty started shifting. From the emergency, we can clearly see that the idea of sovereignty starts shifting, where the state is claiming sovereignty, and people are working to reclaim that sovereignty to themselves. So and the emergency, of course, produced certain things that are visible. The civil liberties movement, of course, started with the anti-Naxal movement in West Bengal. But you see a lot of that growing, so democratic rights, civil rights, Dalit rights, women's rights, over a period of time, the LGBTQ rights. So you can actually see the various kinds of identities begin to develop. And the interesting thing in civil society has been how these different identities have found common platforms amongst ourselves. We've had to work at it. There was a time, for instance, when the women's movement was not wholly averse to death penalty for rape and murder. But quickly, with the human rights movement coming in saying that, no, we need to talk to each other and this is not the route that we take. So we see one set of that. We also see that after the emergency, with this idea of the state as imperiled, laws like TADA, POTA, AFSPA of course has survived, but there was no sunset at all for AFSPA. And UAPA, the idea of public safety. So the public safety is actually about the public being the state, not the public being the public. So this idea of the endangered and imperiled state and the kind of insecurity that they have, that's one of the things that people have had to work with. 84 was also, after the emergency, I think the other big moment was in 84 when, apart from Indira Gandhi getting assassinated, the major thing was the anti-Sikh riots and Bhopal. So they are two dramatic moments, because with Bhopal, it was clear that the relationship between the corporate and the state, what we saw evolving after that relationship was getting cemented, and people were becoming we were all to be there to serve not just the interests of the state anymore, but to serve the interests of the state and of the corporation. And the Narmada movement in the meantime had picked up hugely by then. So we find that by 84, that movement everyone knew about the movement. So that there was a problem with this development paradigm had become clear. The 90s again, and I'm just jumping through a lot of hoops to just get there, which is the early 90s with liberalization coming in, the nature of the state started changing. Where the state was being told, you pull back. You don't have to provide services to the people. You just have to be there to facilitate. Now, facilitate what? So it turned out that they were to facilitate the market. And so they had to the state had to unburden itself of all the commercial interests that it had, and which also meant that all those infrastructure companies and the various kinds of, the kind of things that the state was involved in through PSUs, for instance, which were essential for the development of the state, that was now all getting disinvested. I think it's fascinating that we are a country where we actually had a ministry for disinvestment, to give up what the state has and to hand it over to corporations. It's extraordinary. And then we go through that, through the 90s with a range of things. But in the meantime, civil society too had grown. And so the idea of engaging with the state had changed. So we have an RTI movement, which results in the law. The Narmada movement, which then became the anti-displacement movement, which shifted from land acquisition to mass displacement. Just like the anti-Sikh riots, completely threw to the fore that this was about mass crime and not just about crime. So the idea of masses getting impacted by this had become big. And we have therefore the about 20 years of working, at least 17, 18 years of working on a law which ultimately results in the 2013 Land Acquisition Act change. Imperfect as it is, it's an extraordinary, tale of how people's movements made this change, forced the state to make the change to make changes that were important to make. And then we have the NREGA, we have the food security. All these people-oriented things came from people. It didn't come from the state. Where lawmaking used to be by the state, it was no longer those which were people-oriented, came from the people and made the state act. And I'll just end with this, that now we've come to one time, which is on technology, which we'll discuss later, which is actually changing things so dramatically that I think we need to catch up with it fast, or it'll again overtake us and we'll be like, I was telling you, post-mortem specialists, no? We'll be saying this is what happened and this is how we need to understand it now. I don't think we can afford that. So we need to be able to anticipate it. I think the great thing about civil society interaction and action in many of these things is that we don't need to understand by studying what happened in each case. Having lived through all of this and having studied much of what has already happened, I think we've developed an ability to be able to foretell what is likely to happen and to start preparing.
Thank you. Who goes next? What you have decided?
I will go next. This was the agreement. Okay. So now we have to stick to the agreement. Okay. Anyway, thank you. And thank you, Usha, for that extraordinary account of 70 years, but I think highlighting the specific issues that should come up in today's discussion. Now, the role of civil society organizations in shaping public policy and discourses is our theme. And while we were discussing this between ourselves, one point came up that many terms are used: civil society organizations, civil society, and Usha shied away from attempting to define it. Civil society organizations are also very difficult to define. Almost anything can be defined as a civil society organization if it consists of people come together for a purpose in whatever formation. But then there's this term non-governmental organization that is much more widely used. And there, I think the one point I'd like to put forward is that we have defined these as what they are not, that these are not government. A non-governmental organization is an organization that is not government. And I believe that in that definition, inherent in that definition, is the tension that an opposition creates. It is not government. So if something is not government, the next question is, okay, so what are government and not government doing, or when faced with each other? And that tension can be creative. It can also be destructive. It could be certainly for the person who is not government. And I think it's an important point to remember that very early on in the discourse we recognize that there is a place and role for people who are not government. Very early into the life of independent India, a lot of the sort of work that was non-governmental was, in my belief, still largely Gandhian. It was very much in the social work mode. And things changed with a professionalism being introduced into non-governmental work, and have changed much more. Usha has elaborated on that. But that there is a role and position for organizations and people who are not government is something we've always recognized. Then again, there are, amongst non-governmental organizations, there are many, many different types. They differ in their ideology, in their functioning, in their internal governance, in their objectives. Many non-governmental organizations, many successful non-governmental organizations are successful because they are doing successfully the work that government ought to be doing. Now, if you look at places like the Jan Swasthya Sahyog in Chhattisgarh, Yogesh Jain and his colleagues, the truly wonderful hospital that is run in a completely desolate, it's 2 hours from Raipur airport area. This is the high quality public health activity that a responsible government ought to be doing. So, but since government, for a variety of reasons, is not doing it, an organization in that context has stepped in. There are many such, all of us in our experience would know many other. A little more familiarity with the health sector. I can think of many. The Latika Roy Foundation in Dehradun, for instance, it works with children with disabilities. That ought to be happening in every district hospital in India. The early intervention practices, identifying children with disability, counseling both parents, guardians, that whole process that is so excellently demonstrated in that particular organization is something that government ought to be doing. We hear of many, many stories of non-governmental organizations working in the area of school education. The work that Ramji Raghavan and the Agastya Foundation do in Chittoor, in science education. Ideally, that should have been coming out of the government process itself, because the thousands of government schools are where all this level of teaching ought to be taking place. So there is that. I don't want to labor the point. There is a whole lot of very, very non-governmental organizations doing the work that government ought to be doing, but is not. Then there are many that are doing work that government possibly cannot do. And I would put into this category a large number of these think tank organizations that have come up, which we're not going right now into the question of how good their work is or what motivates them. But the fact that such organizations exist, the Prayas itself is an example, the Center for Science and Environment is an example, the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in Chennai is an example of these are there is field work, there is research, there is analysis, there are policy recommendations, all coming out of a system which is not government. And yes, government certainly through the system of government laboratories, ICMR, ICAR, etc., has its own mechanism, but possibly these are in some ways more vibrant and stronger, certainly the better ones are, than those that are run out of governmental systems. So these also are non-governmental organizations. Another point that means, so I said, let's think, for now, let's look at two broad categories. So NGOs that are doing government's work and NGOs that are doing work that government cannot do, but which government should possibly learn to depend on. And the third and last point that I'd like to make in this round of comment, Usha touched on this. Over the years, the nature of the political has become more and more obvious and evident. Simply because what is not government is doing what government ought to be doing, that is a political situation. Because why is government not doing something? This becomes an election question. This becomes a question that a citizen can legitimately ask the people in power. Why are these things not happening? So that is where the tension arises from, and I think we see that very clearly. There was a time, actually, many people in this hall are very young. Either the 6th or the 7th plan, the plan document that related to 1985 to 1990, it was the first time that the Planning Commission had as a full-fledged chapter in the plan document the role of non-governmental organizations. Bankar Roy led the group that drafted that. Today, with hindsight, we may have many comments quite critical on what was said in that chapter. But at that time, it was revolutionary, because here was government recognizing upfront that in the business of development, in the business of, to use a somewhat discredited term, nation building, that there was a role for organizations that were not government. There was a role in implementation. There was certainly a role in policy making. That was the mid-1980s, the Rajiv Gandhi government, the plan document that they oversaw. So that's there. So the question we need to ask is, where have we moved from that? How long did that thinking drive us? And again, some of you here will remember an organization called CAPART. CAPART itself had its origins in two organizations called CART and PADI. I don't know if anyone remembers all this anymore, but these used to be very, very big things in the 1980s. And CAPART was a government outfit, association for, PADI was People's Action for, CART was Council for Action and I'm getting all confused now. The PA in CAPART was People's Action, definitely. People's Action and Rural Technology. Council for the Advancement of People's Action and Rural Technology. The advancement of people's action was a stated government policy as embodied in CAPART. CAPART was a mess. We're not going there now. But that was very much part of thinking then that this needs to be done. We need to promote, advance people's action and everything else. So that is one issue that's out there. And absolutely the last point I want to make is, we will come back to the question specifically of, when we say role of civil society organizations in shaping public policy, we also should look at which and who are all the various parties or elements who contribute to public policy. I think one question we need to ask is, why is Parliament not doing this? Surely Parliament is public representation at its finest. So why are we saying that non-governmental people should participate? Why are we saying that people's action is necessary? Surely the people are represented in Parliament. I know this. I know exactly what everyone is thinking, but I do believe that in these discussions on what goes into policy making, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get Parliament to work more and to work better and to work more meaningfully and positively in policy making? That was supposed to be their job. And we've kept the structure alive, and it does many things. But why specifically do we see less and less of significant policy coming out of parliamentary debate? And maybe if we're able to answer that question, we will be able to more easily answer the question of what then should civil society organizations do towards the same end. Thank you. As per the terms of the agreement.
You don't do this. There is no agreement.
Okay. Well, first I'd like to thank Prayas, and it's such an honor to be part of this Girish Memorial discussion. And I'm afraid some of what I'm going to say may be very academic, because in sociology we have had a lot of discussion on civil society. I mean, there are endless books and papers in terms of different ways that one can define it. And I'm afraid that my definition of civil society is far more expansive than that of my co-panelists, because if you look at sort of some of the classic definitions, civil society was that space where political economy mattered, where class came in, where difference and inequality manifested itself, as against the state, which was universal, where everybody had political rights. And within that sphere of political economy, then civil society is both a positive and negative term. You also have people like Tocqueville talking about civil society as a space of voluntary association, or what some people today may call political society, as against ascriptive identities or identities that you're born with. And somebody like Gramsci, whose idea of civil society is very well known, talking about civil society as a space where the state was not absent, but the state used it to project soft power through institutions like schools and churches, etc., to elicit consent. So in all of these definitions of civil society is not really separate from the state. And the state enters deeply into the way that civil society operates and vice versa. So I think at one very basic level, if we are to kind of define civil society, I would say that it would be any organized group that is between the family and the state. But that organized group need not be something that is separate from the state. And in fact, if you look at the history of many civil society movements, many of them are products of state action. Let's take, for instance, the demand for reservation, which various caste groups across the country are making. Now, these are civil society groups which are demanding reservation, but the way in which the reason why they're able to demand, or the reason why they're choosing this demand, is because of the state policy of reservation in the first place. And the reason why they have come together as caste groups is also partly because of a whole history of state policy to do with caste censuses, or the ways in which communities began to self-identify. And I think especially living, since we're having this discussion in Pune, I think we need to start a discussion around the state and civil society in India at least as far back as the 19th century, looking at the ways in which Maharashtra's long history of social reform manifested itself in various movements, in various organizations, which then put pressure on the state for a variety of things, whether it was education or anything that you might think about. Many of these caste associations that we have today, again, have these long histories of setting up hostels, of providing what now people, NGOs in the health or education sector are providing, but they were providing it on a caste basis, and then they opened it out to people from other castes. So I think, for one, we need to actually look back at the way that different parts of the country have manifested civil society, reform, etc., both in a positive and negative sense. Now, civil society, I think we have tended to think is positive, but we also have many examples of extremely negative forms of civil society. We only have to look at some current organizations which are running the state and which are engaged in communal violence, etc., to understand how civil society can be both cruel, it can be extremely uncivil. I would include mafia, for instance, as part. I would include the Chambal Valley dacoits, which are performing which at the time that they were active, were performing an important function of settling local disputes, providing land to people. After all, they were providing a function which the state was not providing, which was why they were active and functioning for a long time. And one can give a number of other examples. I do think that, again, what is important is to actually trace out how in each period of time the relations between states and the kinds of organizations which are given power at any point in time. So now, for instance, corporates and the various kinds of associations they set up are actually the dominant voice in civil society. It is not, much as we would like to think that, it is NGOs, people's movements, etc., which are setting the agenda. In fact, everywhere we were discussing this morning, we see, as part of the whole trend towards capitalist commodification, a formalization, moving away from small farmers, small fishers, etc., to large-scale companies, whether it's in the agricultural field or everywhere. So what we talk of as development, we should really be moving away to talk about capitalism studies. And then I think when we look at how things actually operate and how people benefit or don't benefit, then we will have a clearer sense of who is in power in this balance of power between different elements of civil society and the state. Just one more point in this issue. I think we also need to think of since the 50s, if you think about the Constituent Assembly debates, I would say go rather than looking at, I agree that the emergency was a turning point, but I would say even more than that, it was the fact of independence, because after all the people who came to power were civil society before. If you look at some of the early civil liberties movements, Gandhi and the whole Champaran movement, where people like Rajendra Prasad were the lawyers who were recording the statements of the Champaran farmers. It was the kind of stuff that people's movements do today. If you look at Ambedkar and temple entry, how different is that from Sabarimala and temple entry? Look at all sorts of things. And what is in a way tragic is that Ambedkar, who for one would think that this is a man who has come out of struggle, who because of his struggle has ensured that the individual is the locus of citizenship rights in the constitution and not community as many people wanted. Then in his closing address to the Constituent Assembly says, but we no longer need dharnas, we should rely only on constitutional methods of governance. But at the same time, he recognizes that in order for constitutional methods of governance to work, the state has to be equally responsive and equally concerned about giving freedom to people to express themselves. But what we have then is a state which criminalizes other kinds of movements, other kinds of aspirations, and then continues with this extremely statist power, which then leads to something like the emergency. And something just to want to end with what's happening now is I'm not sure that I agree that the emergency was this major, I agree that it was a major point in the history of Indian democracy, in the history of Indian relationships with civil society and the state. But in a way, the Constitution, while it gave us a lot of rights, it gave us very important new visions, also closed off all sorts of other things that people wanted at that time. And if you think of what happened immediately after independence, you have the bombing of, in the 50s and 60s, you have the bombing of Nagaland and Mizoram, perhaps the first time, where a country has bombed its own people, like at least in India. You have preventive detention immediately. You had the Kharsavan firing in 1948, where Adivasis were killed. Jaipal Singh is writing to Rajendra Prasad saying, what is this? We have just got independence and we have this major firing. And I think we forget that actually Indian history has had these moments where things get closed off, new things begin, and then things get closed off again and new types of beginnings take place. And I think the major difference between the emergency and now is that there at least you had that difference between the state and society, so that you could have a movement against the emergency, whereas now the state is running through civil society. And this is a sort of semi-fascist phenomena where the RSS occupies the space of both the state and civil society. So the primary mode of governance is getting people and communities to fight among themselves. And the state can then claim to be neutral, whereas it acts very decisively in favor of one party. So I think the relationship has drastically transformed, and I don't think the emergency was actually so much of a divider as this new co-optation of civil society into the state. Because the RSS, let us not have any doubt, is the biggest NGO, the biggest civil society organization in the country today. It gets the maximum funding, it has a maximum membership. It is the most powerful civil society organization.
Actually, that opens up very nicely this debate. The thing is, because something we want to change, and when that change comes, you are the owner of that change. With that ownership comes the power. And when you get the power, you want to keep the power. And so that's why you have then policies which are designed to keep you in power, and it's nothing to do with the people. So in the morning also someone said that we have to see that we end the problems. I never think that there would be end to any problems, because you end one problem and you create another one. And in that sense, actually, the role of civil society will be always divided, because as someone in the morning said, civil society versus uncivil society is the debate, which way you stand, which side you stand on. And if you are standing on the side of the marginalized, then the civil society of the empowered will feel that you are being uncivil. And in that sense, you brought that out. But then the question is, if we want to have in democracy, whether the space for this kind of, because democracy is defined by having space for debate, dialogue, disagreement, dissent. That defines democracy. And the space for not only dissent, but even dialogue is shrinking. So in that sense, what do you think are the times which were, we have talked about what was the past, but looking at what is today and what could be tomorrow, and what could be done for that? Because I think the whole purpose of this panel discussion is not to just crib about that our space has been taken away by someone. Unless we talk about what are the ways and means, and we'll come back to actually using the technology maybe to further that, because that's an important tool in our hand maybe. We'll be coming to that later, but what do you think, Keshav? We can start now.
You answer the technology part. No, I don't have a clear answer at this point.
I'll just step in. Okay. No, the first thing I want to say is that in all those cataclysmic moments, my friends in Delhi will throw me out of North India because they said people south of the Vindhyas don't seem to understand that partition happened. So first I want to acknowledge that that perhaps was the biggest moment in that I can think of. And I was thinking when you were talking that in relation to that abducted women who were rescued, the people who went in to do the rescue were people who went as social workers. And the kind of discussions we have now when we discuss that law and when we discuss what happened in that period is very different from the spirit in which that it was done then. And they did it in collaboration with the state. And actually as state functionaries and as people who the state trusted, who were part of the larger family of the state in a sense. So that, first thing is to acknowledge that and see what that meant when the state depended on people that it could trust in society who were part of the larger, part of many families within the state. And yet, they depended on them to be able to solve some of the sticky issues that existed then. I think it's a good thing that we have a tension on the emergency because I think we need to have it. Because the reason that I think the emergency is so important is also because I think there's been a routinizing of the emergency that has happened after that, where things that were extraordinary during the emergency happened routinely since. So it doesn't happen in the name of the emergency. There is no need to declare anything at all. For instance, urban demolitions. When Turkman Gate happened, it was a moment that nobody forgot. It's happening every day today, in city after city. And the idea that the poor can never be legal and that they can never legally exist in our midst is not even considered. If pre-emergency, the state had the onus was on the state to, when they demolished any place, to provide an alternative resettlement existed. We've come to times where you have both policymakers and courts saying that resettling people is actually a state offense. That these are people who are encroachers and they have therefore no rights at all. So we've actually moved in a way where many of the things that we did during the emergency have got routinized, and that's the reason for me that it's so important. Not just that something happened in those 2 years, and also the kind of impetus that it gave for so many people to find the various issues which that during the emergency was recognized as being threatened. And I find that has come back now. The difference being that the emergency lasted for a certain period. Nobody knew while it was on how long it would last, and then it erupted after that. But now, because it has got routinized, and then when you have a government that says, you can't speak about me, you have to have affection for me, and anything else will be treated as an offense, and I have the power to do what I want over you. The 3 ways in which, for instance, we learn to talk about this, which is power, control, and authority, where power is not bound by any kind of law or norms or anything. It's the fact that I have raw power is sufficient. And control is control over a people, and authority is under the law. and how authority has slowly been ceding, not so slowly been ceding power, ceding space to power. And so we don't have principled action anymore. And I find the importance of people's movements has been that there are many people who would be forgotten. I think the most important thing that civil society has done is to provide the friction that is needed. It's not about whether we get what we think should be got. It's that you cannot not do certain things, and we cannot forget that there is a certain moral space that has to be, an ethical space that has to be occupied by people. So when we are speaking, that's why there is a difference between an RSS doing what it does and the way we view it, the way we would see movements on the ground of other kinds and how we would view it. And we know the difference. They may still be the most powerful, they are the most powerful, and they are the best fed and best taken care of. But it's very difficult for them to get that kind of moral authority among those who see clearly what they are. Whereas that's not true for movements on the ground. If you take the anti-dam movement, for instance, they might have been treated as annoyances by a state that just saw that as, but the illegitimacy, even among those who disagreed with that movement, wouldn't be as strong. It's just that, the idea that we shouldn't have protest, we shouldn't have demonstration, dissent should stop, you should allow the state to function, which existed for a while. I think that, that shifts, it goes back and forth on this. But I just want to go back to your point on ending a problem. I said that, so I'll just say why I'm saying that. See, very often we see a problem and then we are trying to deal with it, and we find the principles on which we deal with it. We find what are good advocacy tools. We figure out what people themselves feel about what's happening with their lives, and it's a responsibility. It's a huge responsibility. Many of these should have endings. For instance, TADA had an ending. It restarted with POTA, and then that had an ending. And then it's carried on with UAPA. But when we recognize endings, then we know how we move. Otherwise, it's like it's like a slope all the way. Actually, there are steps too in that. And the place that taught me this was the manual, the movement to eradicate manual scavenging, where they refused to register as an organization because they said registering in one sense is saying that there is a perpetuity involved in it. Whereas we are saying that we need to end it. And the idea is not to have a movement forever and ever on the eradication of manual scavenging, but to eradicate it, which means there has to be a finiteness to it. And recognizing those kinds of finitenesses for certain practices which are simply not okay. For instance, the way impunity has grown in our midst. I think that is important. I mean, I'm just saying there are ways of thinking about these where it might help us to grasp and not just engage with some of these issues.
Continuity of
both the break and the continuity and an end. I actually believe in the end which every film gives us.
Okay.
I'd just like to make one quick comment. On the emergency, you are both correct. There is no, I think the point, Nandini, that you made. Sorry, I was just saying that on the question of the emergency, both of them are correct because you've made different and very important points. One, Usha's point is that Nandini's point was during 1975, during the emergency, the other was in some manner identifiable. But that situation is not today's situation where the distinction has been consciously, deliberately removed, which is, I think, an extremely important point. And what Usha says is also the same, that that practices that came about then as practiced by an oppressive state continue to be done so routinely now, even though there is no formal declaration of emergency. So there's no. I think the common point is that it was a watershed moment in many, many ways, and much of what we see today need to be traced back to that time. Just
having traced back to that, like in today's situation, how do you think? That's what I was saying. Today and tomorrow.
Well, listen, I have spent all my life working in government, so I look at what do I see in today's situation. civil society activism has to concentrate on greater resources available to the public sector. I mean, this may be a very limited way of looking at the whole story, but my friends will look at much larger aspects. But as someone steeped in government ways, I've always felt that despite the many, many very impressive things that we have seen happening through the work of non-governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations, the fundamental responsibility is still that of government. While I praise and work with people doing great work in healthcare or in school education or whatever, these are all jobs that government should be doing. And the bigger picture is the government's responsibility. Providing for that bigger picture is the government's responsibility. We were talking earlier, again, to go back to the health sector, that the biggest thing happening in health policy today is that it is being sold. Now, how do you reverse this? You reverse this by providing resources, about financial resources, human resources, material resources, to strengthen the public health systems. Now, this is something I believe that with all the dangers involved right now in just being or existing as a civil society group or as a non-governmental organization, it's what people have to fight for in different sectors. There is a political element to the takeover of systems, but what this is also doing is government is giving up on its constitutional responsibilities towards the people. One by one, if government functions are outsourced, which is a polite way of saying sold, there's nothing left.
Yeah, but we were having this discussion and they wanted us to discuss about health. Before I come to you, Nandini, the thing is, that's the role of the civil society I would look at, because the health is being sold under the name of Ayushman Bharat to the whatever insurance and kind of matter. Now this, for whatever reason, would be supported by the largest civil society organization in this country. Now, how do we actually pitch in to change the policy as a civil society organization? One thing would be research, but otherwise, what?
No, you're not going to be able to change the policy in this government. So remember that. But I think the kind of pressure that needs to be brought to bear is actually on state governments. The Constitution makes healthcare a state subject. Medical education is on the concurrent list, but healthcare is on the state list. I think a lot of focus needs to be given to the states. Some states have historically shown greater responsibility, Tamil Nadu being the most prominent amongst them. But states really need to step up considerably, substantially their investment. Just give you one example of how poorly states have done. All of Uttar Pradesh with 80 districts has got 10 government medical colleges. I mean, that is a scandal. Only 10 government medical colleges in all of Uttar Pradesh. No government, Congress, BJP, BSP, SP, nobody has seen it necessary to invest in medical education and nursing education. You cannot have public health without a robust, functioning public health system with properly trained people running that system. Tamil Nadu has a government medical college in every district, even the new districts. So it just shows it can be done. That actually came not necessarily because of civil society pressure, but because for all their shortcomings, the division parties have been committed to the cause of healthcare, childcare, women's empowerment. And that just happened without a fight, as it were. But in states where there is opposition, or states where the government is just not thinking on these lines, that is a very important area to press for. Ayushman Bharat has got a component called wellness centers. Those wellness centers are not going to happen unless you have trained doctors, nurses, technicians of every sort. This government has introduced an allied health professionals bill in Parliament that lists 103 distinct categories of allied health professionals. Excellent work. Excellent work has been done. It's a very good, in principle, without going into every clause of the bill, that the allied health sector needs to be regulated is a good point. And there is a draft resolution that has gone to the trouble. But where are these? These are huge skill development opportunities, which is also a priority for government. But it needs to happen. State governments need to now invest in creating places, facilities, using the best technology available so that all those categories of allied health professionals actually exist, can come up, and can earn a decent living. Those are the kinds of things I believe that we need to fight for, especially through the civil society sector, because the governments have created the laws. There is a very good law, the Clinical Establishments Act of 2010. Every sort of fly-by-night medical establishment will come under control if that act was enforced. Nobody wants to enforce it. I don't know whether Maharashtra has adopted it, but even the states that have adopted it have done nothing. It's a very, very good law. This brings me to a larger point. Many of our laws, which in recent times have often come through intense public participation and civil society contribution before being actually passed, we are excited only as long as the process is going on and it is before Parliament. We don't seem to have a similar system that monitors, are these things happening? In some cases, maybe there are, for instance, if there's legislation regarding bonded labor, there are people who monitor. Usha and her colleagues monitor very closely everything to do with manual scavenging and everything else. But there are some other laws that no one is looking at. So clinical establishments, no one is looking at. Notoriously, the Indian Medical Council Act of 1956. What we see today, let us also not forget the situation to which the Medical Council of India has reduced the health sector has been with the active and willing participation of hundreds and hundreds of people who own these colleges, run these colleges, teach in these colleges, practice in the hospitals associated with these colleges. So everyone is complicit. Now, so it's not going to be easy to fight this, but the short answer is, how best can we use the structures available with us already without creating new laws, without creating new systems? How do we get the Medical Council and its even more appalling sister, the Nursing Council, to work? How do you get the existing laws to work? How do you get governments to invest in medical and nursing education? And stuff like that. All governments like to set up an AIIMS because there is 15,000 crores of construction immediately. Nobody wants to set up, a rather more humble facility that will actually do some work.
So that's one of the examples. One of the questions was, what are the areas in which, or what are the ways or kind of systems in which we feel that a civil society has been effective, could be effective. And health we have discussed. I think we'll not go back to health now because we know exactly what are the problems in health. Absolutely. Much more. But we'll look at the other spaces where civil society has a bigger role, would be more successful, more effective. And it's not only for the effectiveness, but some places would be where it may not be effective at all, but we'll have to occupy that space by whatever means.
Civil society has been arguing for are necessarily positive. So there are various civil society organizations, movements which have been very successful at putting certain very negative things on.
Mike, your mic isn't working.
So just saying that I don't think that we should start with only looking at where civil society has been positive in our sense of meeting genuine demands, basic needs, because actually you might argue that the most effective civil society movement has been the movement for the Ram Mandir, legitimate or not. And I think the issue is not that people's movements are more legitimate even in the eyes of their detractors, but that legitimacy is created through the media, through governmental approval. And so, for instance, the Naxalites, who 10 years ago were legitimate, even the government agreed that, they were legitimate to the extent that people said they were misguided, but they had the right ideology. Now, after 10 years of relentless propaganda, they are classified as pure terrorists with no ideology, right? And public at large doesn't really know unless the public is living in areas where they are active. So legitimizing somebody, not legitimizing somebody is as much a function of what they do as a wider impulse. But in terms of where, in a positive sense, I think civil society has been very effective. One has been in the sphere of personal rights. So I think the struggle for 377 to be repealed was a very successful movement, which certainly created huge amounts of enthusiasm among the public. And one didn't realize how important it is to people till after the fact, in a sense, that people began to come out and tell their stories. And then you realize how much pain there had been in this country because of that. Even though it was not something that was very visible, or I think as large-scale mobilizations, again, right to information, Narega, Forest Rights Act, Land Acquisition Act, all of these were, Right to Education Act, have been, I think, very positive movements that have resulted in change. But I think what's also disturbing is that education and health somehow have just not been, right from the beginning, movements that have, or issues that have been able to, haven't become matters of public agenda, debate, etc., in the way that they should have. And it's quite shocking that we didn't have education as a fundamental right from the beginning. And the major discussion on education was in the Constituent Assembly date was in the context of prohibition, where they were debating whether to have prohibition because then people wouldn't spend their money on liquor and would educate their children, or whether they should have excise duties and raise money to spend, for the government to spend on education. So it was nothing to do really with whether the people should have a right to be educated. And if you look at, for instance, all the tribal movements in the Adivasi rebellions, one of their prime demands has been, we want education, we want schools. And the government responded by saying that, you don't need schools because that's actually an alien force and you will be, so that's why we are withdrawing the schools. It is quite shocking the way that schooling has been used to entrench class privilege in this country. And therefore, it has not allowed people to mobilize on it.
Slightly different tag, but I think one of the things that we've learned over the past as movements, what we've learned from the movements is this idea of eminent domain. And I think it's going to become even more important as time passes, because eminent domain in its classical form was about private land and private land being allowed to be taken for a public purpose on payment of compensation. That has got expanded in ways which are truly extraordinary, where the state has laid claim to all land in the territory, saying this is ours and you have it at our sufferance and we'll take it back whenever we want it. And then it moved on to water, it moved on to mineral resources, it's moved on to forests, and in forests there has been a kind of, there's been some success in getting that off from the state and not allowing the state to become the owner of everything that there is, and saying that, or a super owner or super landlord or whatever. But we are entering a new area. So since technology is one of our areas of discussion today, I just thought I'd say that the new resource that's being created and the new resource over which eminent domain is being asserted, in the way in which eminent domain has been expansively defined in relation to land and water and resources, mineral resources, it's that new resource is personal information. So we are seeing a number of things happening around us which are about, it's actually an interesting time. See, technology 10 years ago was seen as something that is exciting, new. It was, helping people, it was helping connect people, not just not just people we know, but connecting people with worlds which we didn't know, new ideas flowing through. In 10 years, there has been a decline in the legitimacy, in the kind of trust and delight that we had in technology. And now you hear about what Facebook has been doing, what Google has been doing. And the language that the Indian technology companies are bringing in is a language of digital colonization, saying that these companies, Amazon and Google and Microsoft and all the rest, are colonizing us. So Mukesh Ambani says it very well. He says, all these companies have taken our, the data of our people. Now the Indian people need to get back rights to their own data, or in any case, the Indian corporates should. So the idea that colonization should not happen by an foreign entity, but should happen by our own technology people. And there is an additional element to this, because we know that even in the land movements, in the displacement, land displacement resources movements, we've always recognized that this is not specific to India alone, and many of the kinds of ideas that we develop here, many of the kinds of changes that we attempt to bring here, will have an impact on a large part of the developing world. This is true for what is being done with technology too. Technology, there is a benign use, there is a way in which we can think about technology in a benign way, because it has possibilities, and there are ways in which it can be used through those possibilities. But the push today is to use it to create other businesses. So those other, we were talking through this period, it's a trickle down effect period which did not work. Now they are talking about trickle up. So technology fellows are saying that the data will trickle up. People don't have anything to offer the market or the nation because you're all too poor. But you have something that can in fact develop an economy, which is your data. So your personal information will trickle up. You will leave digital footprints everywhere. And those digital footprints will be collected, and it should be possible to identify whose footprints these are. And it's also important to remember, when they keep saying artificial intelligence, they need all of us to give as much information as we can, because it crunches data and creates another form of intelligence. Without the data, it can't create that intelligence. So they need it at any cost, and multiple distortions are going to come in with this. So we are actually poised at a time where we need to look backward to understand what we are looking at when we look forward. And eminent domain is a classic case, except that in this case, it is not being done through the state, because the state has already been told since 2011 at least, quite explicitly, that the state has no ability to deal with data, it has no ability, it doesn't know technology, so hand it over to companies and to people who want to build this business. There's a whole cabal called the India Stack that has been created. It's housed in something called iceberg, and if we just look at it's not just conflict of interest, it's a takeover of many of the things that are important to us, which is like freedom, liberty, which are now words which we've stopped using. I think we need to use them much more. So this idea that using eminent domain, which is the state says, all of you have individual rights. That's why they went to the court and said you don't have a right to privacy. It wasn't just about privacy. It was saying that your rights exist so that you can use those rights to contribute to the community. And that community is the state, which will then create a national economy. So we are talking of something completely different. I don't think we can wait to figure this out. I think we need to do it, which is why this morning I was saying that, we looked at demonetization the way it was talked to us about it. But actually demonetization wasn't just that. We look at cashlessness as if it's only about convenience and about companies. Which are good. It's much more than that. And the message that we are getting today is that you're subjects of the state and objects of this exercise. Forget the idea of citizenship. So if everything can be monitored, if we can be surveilled in various kinds of ways, like look at the brazenness of the December 20th order, where they say these are the 10 agencies who we are empowering to go into anybody's computer, decrypt whatever you want, monitor whatever there is in it, read whatever there is, and we are giving you the authority. Who is the state to give this authority? Who are these agencies that are being given this authority? And why do they want this power? So I just think that any work that we do, that's why I feel like my worry is that we've shallowed out quite a bit. We've been reactive. I fear that we've shallowed out. I hope I'm wrong. I think we need to lateralize and we need to deepen. If we don't do this, then we will be, see, I genuinely believe, and I think many people here would agree with that, that protest is an expression of a lot of understanding that we've got. So it's not, the slogan is an essence of what we've discovered. But I fear that, many people who are speaking the slogan understand the slogan, but don't really get how many things go behind it. And I think we need to get a little harder on that and drive ourselves a little more in those directions too. I'm sorry, I am going to return to health for just 1 minute to say that health has in fact been among the early sectors where these technologies are being used to take whatever data they can, because they want to, they call it big data, then they call it algorithmic treatment of things. They say we can figure out what problem exists. And technology companies today, unlike oil companies, they say data is the new oil. Technology companies are not confining themselves to technology. They are saying we are in health, we are in education, we are in every kind of forum that you want. We'll provide you with solutions. And by now we know that technology is, they say technology is neutral, it's incorruptible, it's infallible. None of this is true, because technology is not some neutral entity, it's controlled by somebody. It's, so their interests, and it's not just their interests, their prejudices, their priorities, and what they want to do with us, all of that determines what that technology will be. So I think we need to get a little harder on some of this stuff.
Just a brief response to that, because one of the ways in which actually our organization Prayas has been asking for is, for example, our health group also. What we are saying is that we are not able to analyze things because there is not enough data available. So if we want to understand the problem, it's a huge gap, and we want to have data. Another thing which we always say is that it's not only we should have the data, but majority of the data should be available in the public domain, so that people can understand what is happening, and whether it is energy, whether it is health. And at the other end, we are saying that more data we will give, more likely to be, we are likely to be governed. So at this juncture where...
So can I just come in for a moment? It's a trap. Don't fall into that trap. See, we are saying data as if it is some kind of, some kind of thing that we just use in certain purposes and then it goes off. I think we need to analyze what we mean when we say data. What kind of information are we collecting? From whom are we collecting it? How do we retain it? Who gets access to it? And what can be done with it? For instance, I genuinely believe that in sensitive medical issues should never be held in computers. That information should never be held in computers. Any computer can be hacked. Any kind of system can be, you don't even know, every minute it's perhaps going away somewhere. And I think we need to value that idea of sensitive information and not put it. But it's very convenient. Today, anybody comes in, the first thing we do is tap everything into a computer, because somewhere when it was land and we were losing land, you could see it. What is happening with technology and with this idea of data, it's not even a developed idea, is that we think that it is just some data that we are going to use and that's it. We don't even understand how many things happen with it. So it's a trap. So when you say you want data to be able to treat a person, just think again about what it means. Today in your health information management systems, management information system, some years ago they already started keeping information on reproductive rights. They'll say how many children have they already had, how many abortions have they had, have they come for a miscarriage or not, are they sterilized or not. This is deeply sensitive information which can be used in multiple ways, which we know now, which we now know. So I think this idea of neutral idea of technology, neutral idea of data, we need to abandon and find whether there are ways we can, in which we use technology as a tool and not allow technology to, the presence of technology to determine what we do with it. There's a difference. And we need to figure out what that difference is and then use it. Just one thing that, this time for instance in Parliament, there are two bills that are pending in the Rajya Sabha, which has been steamrollered through the Lok Sabha. One is on the Aadhaar Amendment Bill. See, the UID was never a standalone project because they said we'll use biometrics. Biometrics are deeply problematic, and they had started it all off without even testing any of it. The purpose of that unique thing was the unique number. So as early as in 2010, Mr. Nilekani had openly told us that, you know what, all this roti kapda or makan business is passe. What we are now concerned, what everybody will now want is bank account, Aadhaar and mobile. So this was a jam trinity. So that's the Jan Dhan Yojana, Aadhaar and mobile. The combination of these three is what is going to create businesses for them. Now they are saying, and when they came in, they said, put your number everywhere because we want to be able to track everyone, because that's the only way we'll decide whether you're worthy of credit or not, and that's how they started. So we are looking at ways in which this is no longer about technology. This is about the uses of what possibilities technology seem to offer. And those possibilities are not even real, but for them 40, 50, 60%, if they have, that's enough for them to create their businesses. What we are left with is the problem. So before we jump onto this bandwagon, I think they're giving us many, many indications of what the uses of technologies are, what social credit system is. China is providing us with a brilliant example of what it means to have social credit system. Yesterday in the Tamil Nadu budget, like the Delhi government, they say we'll have CCTVs everywhere, like that's a great thing. And there are many of us who think, wow, we'll be safe with CCTVs. Obviously, we have no idea of what safety is. So we haven't debated any of this. For people who have been confronting the state on many of the things, like keeping the state, what is it that many of us do? It's making the state act like it is supposed to act. And the job of the state is to protect and preserve our freedom and our liberty, which is getting forgotten. And to ensure that the people of this country are given things that will help them assert their sovereignty, which means if people are poor, poverty has to be dealt with. Now what's happening is that they're creating, because of this collaboration between the state and technology companies especially, the state has become partially a customer and partly it has become the coercive arm which will produce for business whatever it wants. That is the world of technology today, and I think we need to be aware of it. With that.
Nandini, this is for you. Like, because you have been.
Why are you looking like that?
This whole, when this friction is provided by the people, and people's movements and civil society, there would be a friction between the political ways and means of achieving things and the civil society achieving certain goals. Now, for stated objective of any political system would be, as she was saying, is to help the people to come out of whatever their problems are. Now, what do you think, what is your opinion about this? People's movements talking about people versus the political systems, and there is always a friction. And
So just, I'll just respond to that, but I just want to say, it's interesting how they're so hell-bent on collecting data, but on the other hand, they happily manufacture data when they need to or they want, and they have no data. For instance, the charge that Sudha Bhardwaj has a case against, there's some letter to her, but the letter is written in Marathi kind of diction, etc. So, you can create data when you want to, and you can search for data, which is
and unemployment data.
Yeah, so it's
so sorry.
So, but in terms of how the state thinks of people and people think of people, and again, I think people are divided, so there is no one clear answer to that. But I do think that we need to go back to a stage where we are far more interested in getting political power than we have been as people's movements or as NGOs, etc. And politics makes a huge difference. So if you do have a state government that for some reason or the other thinks that it's important to have universal health, then it will happen because it's been voted into power and it matters. So getting things into the public agenda as political issues and really concentrating on ways in which politics can become more accessible to people through electoral reform law, through control over all sorts of things, because we don't have an alternative right now. We need to, I'm looking for a political party that I can join, but I haven't found one.
Set it up.
I just have one question.
That's a big thing, setting up political parties, coming out of people's movements.
Can I just, Usha, what you were just saying about technology, what can we look for in terms of a technology regulator, for want of a better word? I mean, I see everything you say. The dangers are known, dangers have been proved, but also technology has come, technology will not go away, it's there. In our situation, in our legal system, in our political system, what can be done to ensure data protection? Or are there countries we can learn from, or is there corruption everywhere in this matter? Because you see, no, some amount of data, for instance, always being corrected. I'm sure even in census data, there is a lot which is quite sensitive. And in principle, all data collected needs to have a certain degree of security. How do you ensure that? Clearly, we are not doing it now. How do we do it if we want to do it? If government wants to do it, is it something that we can demand from parties going into elections this summer? This is what we would like to see happening on the data protection and security front.
So the first thing is that in data protection, if I can just go back,
please.
I stopped something midway. So in this session, they have the Aadhaar Amendment Act, which has these three elements. When I was saying that the roti kapda or makan going away in the other three, the first part of the thing is saying companies can now get access to to use the database in various kinds of ways. The second is saying that banks can now collect the UID number and link it, and the third is saying mobile phones you can use it. So the jam trinity is a very real thing, and I think that's something that we should, when we recognize, we can start doing things about it. The second bill is the DNA bill, use and regulation bill, and it has a history, it's about 15 years old, 16 years old, that history, and it's not a very pretty history. But we've come to one point where in Parliament, if you're going to tell lies on a bill, you say this is a bill to deal with basically criminal cases. And then you go on to the schedule and you see, first of all, you find that every DNA lab doing any kind of any testing of DNA will have to get accredited. And every accredited lab will have to give all the DNA results that it has to a regional DNA data bank, to a national DNA data bank. Who are all these people? I mean, which will take me to your thing. And the schedule talks about what it will be used for, which includes pedigree, determining issues of pedigree, issues of immigration and immigration, issues of identification, individual identity. It's kind of bizarre. And then it has prevention of domestic violence law. It has prenatal diagnostic techniques. So whose DNA are you going to collect? What are you going to keep it for? Why are you databasing everyone? So it is important that when these bills come, we need to get active and stop them from coming. Because once they come, pulling back on it is harder. It's not, I don't believe at all, Keshav, that if it has come, we have to only figure out how to regulate it. I think some of this has to be destroyed. There is no choice. The other thing is that when you say what do you do about regulating, that's not how, I don't think we should go down that route, because when Sri Krishna committee was sitting and we had the first meeting, the one thing that we managed to establish with them was that data protection is not about protecting data. It is about protecting people, which means that you can't say that I will collect all the data that I want, I'll keep it carefully. No. Not okay. You are not collecting it. You don't have any right to have it in the first place. So that idea that, all these, if you read the data protection law that we have now, which Sri Krishna committee produced, it's about how businesses will conduct themselves on using data for their business. It's not about whether they can and what kind of data they can. And they've exempted the state, so the company cannot coercively collect data, but the state can coercively collect data, keep it and share it with the company. I mean, what are we dealing with? So I really don't think that the debate on data protection makes any sense in this context. It is about whether data in fact can be generated, can be allowed to be generated. For instance, we are all very innocent when it comes to things like digitization. We think digitization is okay. after all we are only digitizing, it will be more convenient. We haven't even understood yet, and I too haven't understood it, so I'm not pretending like I know something more than anybody else. But I can see the dangers of digitization, which then, and it's just the first step to many other things. So once you digitize, you have everything on the computer. Now you have one order saying, okay, you have since 2011 a rule that says that the government can ask any agency which is holding information in electronic form, including, for instance, an ultrasound or imaging clinic, and say, give us all that information because we are investigating something. And they have to give it. So it's, the rule making comes after we've learned to recognize the ambitions of these people. So the ambition of the state, and again, the kind of way in which the state has been told that your abilities are limited. We will service you. What is the GST? I mean, GSTN, that whole data is being held by a company that has been set up. It's astonishing for me that in 2011, they produce a report where they say GSTN should be a private company because government can't handle all that data. Network, GST network. And then you have in 2012, Pranab Mukherjee saying that GSTN, the network when it comes, will be a national information utility, which is a euphemism for a private company that's going to hold all this information. And in 2013, the company is set up, and the discussions have been going on about GST and whether the law will be passed or not, and that happens some 3-4 years later. The company has already put its foot in to say at the door saying, give all that information to me. It's gone to that company. Now this government says, oh my God, we didn't realize that you had this kind of information. I want it to become 100% government company because I want control over it now. And then they are told, no, you can have control over it, but you won't have any ability to manage it. So they're saying, okay, you keep it, but you share that information with me. This is the times we are going through. So I don't know that, I'm not getting too much into data protection because I find that it's coming at a different stage and we are not there. Secondly, like we said this morning, we are not a rule of law society. You can make any rules you want, they'll only be, So the way law is being read here is that we have for instance, criminal law. What you were saying about Sudha, for instance. You have criminal law, and criminal law is something that the state uses. And it determines who is a criminal, how they want to treat them. And instead of criminal law being the limits of the power of the state, it has become power of a state to control a people. So criminal law has become a tool for control. So if we are doing all this in the midst of that, so rule making and rule of law is not something, Germany may have it. Germany gave us the best example of why we should not have this kind of database.
But I want to ask a question. You're assuming that the population upon which all this data theft is happening or whatever is the same, but human beings are fundamentally changed by technology. For instance, mobile phones are now such an extension of people that and if the technology allows mobile operators to take away certain kinds of data as a condition for using it, many people will not give up their mobile phones knowing that this is a kind of trade-off that they're willing to make. So any kind of technology, we are no longer, we constantly change as even bodies that relate to technology.
So that's in fact the point. Although I don't know why people can't just throw away their mobile phones, but that's a different story. The thing is that, it's very interesting in one... Oh, I forgot it was on. Okay, so in one of the interviews, Nilekani says, why is everyone complaining about Aadhaar? Smartphone is even more pernicious. I am pernicious, it is even more pernicious, yeah? So the thing is, many of these technologies can actually have privacy by design, which means that you cannot have this kind of invasiveness and intrusion. Governments, especially our government, has been working saying you cannot have that privacy by design. You must give us the key so that we can decrypt. We need to be able, when they're talking data localization here, they are not talking about it in terms of our data fleeing to other countries. They're saying, I want control over all the data of the people in my country. And that is actually, technology doesn't have to go down that route. So I'm not suggesting that technology we cast aside and nobody use it. I'm saying we need to fight those battles to make sure that it doesn't become a tool to control us. You can continue to have your mobile phone, while we fight the battle with the state saying that you must have privacy by design, where, like with WhatsApp, what's happening with WhatsApp now? They're saying decrypt, give us access. Because we are saying that, the state says all these riots and, lynchings are happening. because WhatsApp is spreading the message. So we want to read everybody's WhatsApp. They actually plan to set up a whole monitoring cell inside the INB, which was to produce 6 reports a day on who's leading the conversation on the social media, what is being done on social media, who is following whom, who do they need. So it's like finding out who they need to control, who they need to neutralize. This kind of power is being handed over to the state using these technologies. And it's possible to have the same technologies without these abilities. It is possible. It's possible in technology by privacy by design. It's not being permitted by states, and companies are not interested. For instance, Apple tried it. When you remember what BlackBerry, when they came here, the big battle was to say that no, we will not allow you to come in with an instrument which we cannot invade. So, and if you talk to the free software movement people, they'll say it is possible to do these, but privacy by design means that neither the company nor the state will be able to access certain kinds of information, about what we are doing with it. And that neither the state nor companies want now. Most companies don't want it.
Nobody would want it because the data they collect creates more business for them.
Correct. So
that's the model, but we'll have to fight that. We are coming to the last section of this discussion, and we have got some questions from the audience also. There are 2 questions which are related, and one is for Nandini and other not a specific person to answer, but I would take them together. Naxal movement is civil, so agreed. What is their agenda today and why they don't do it in formal ways like other civil society organizations? Why they need secrecy in working? And that comes to the second question, which is how do we understand what is the ethical space and who defines what is unethical space, and how do we do the alternative ethical space if the space occupied is what we feel by, say, for example, right-wing organizations is unethical space occupied. How do we create an alternative space? So you make.
Actually, the Naxal movement is a good example to talk about the ways in which something may be a part of civil society but not be civil, and therefore the relationship, civil in the sense of sticking to the existing law, because I think these are 2 entirely different questions. They are part of civil society to the extent that they are in opposition to the state, and they are a political movement and a social movement which is engaged in a certain kind of thing. Now, if you look at what constitutes civil society in this country, Bajrang Dal is considered civil society. Bajrang Dal, VHP have all engaged in violence to a large extent. They officially will not say that they are violent, but in practice they are being supported by the state, all your cow vigilantes. So you can't have a situation where the government says, I will support one set of violent actors and not support and fight against another set of violent actors. So what the state defines as civil and uncivil is partly a problem, and I don't think that in our theoretical understanding we should allow the state's definition to enter. Having said that, I do think that the Naxalites have no understanding of capital as it is operating today. I think that it is a seriously limited vision in that sense that they need to understand that fighting in one little jungle is not going to be able to overthrow capital. Maximum the company will not be able to set up plant for some time, or they'll just build camps around, security camps around every single sacred hill in this country, which is what they're doing in Surjagad or in Niyamgiri or in Raoghat or any area. Government will just take it over in conjunction with corporates. So at the same time, I think that many of the things that civil society has been fighting for, and this is something that has worried me for a long time, that people have been talking about implementing PESA or the Forest Rights Act or land distribution, etc. Now, in those limited areas, there is some sort of PESA because people are, at least from my experience in Bastar, villages are collectively organizing to do various things in their village, like build irrigation ponds or do some land distribution. Now, whether that is a product of the Maoists being a kind of parallel state who are also exercising force, and so if people don't want to take part in that collective irrigation pond building, they will then be, punished in some sense. So I think they are not civil society to the extent that they're a parallel state, but then so is the Shiv Sena in a sense. Like, so many organizations are in many ways taking on state functions. So I think our understanding of what the relationship between civil society and the state and what constitutes state functions, what constitute civil society functions, is something that we need to complicate, as well as the idea that civil society is necessarily civil. And also, I want to just come back to this question of technology. I don't think that not just in terms of privacy, but I think our lives are fundamentally, this is an old debate about whether technology is controlled by the same social structures and institutions, and it's they who are actually deciding what, or technology is in a sense deterministic. And I think we need to really emphasize how they are co-producing society, co-producing humans, so that we are fundamentally different people with the kinds of technologies that we have today. And there is a problem in that, and I think this is something that really is older, but from the 20th century, the rise of mass media, rise of mass industrialized capitalism, we are on a different plane. And again, it worries me that we don't really have the social institutions to control it.
Sure, this is a question for you. When you say something is a job of the government, for example, providing services or formulating a policy, are you implying there is no role for civil society? And if there is a role, what is it, and is there a space for it?
No, I certainly did not say, and I do not believe that there is no role for civil society. I only meant that the canvas is so big that if you talk about public health, healthcare, universal healthcare on the scale that it implies and on which it is to be implemented can only be provided by government. Civil society organizations can do extraordinary work, but even the best of them are limited by geography and resources and talent and everything else. The difficult question is, how do you get that quality of commitment? I don't think you can, but people are trying. How do you get the kind of commitment and motivation and devotion to duty that you find in some of our finest civil society organizations into a government setup? I have known outstanding district hospitals and community health centers in the government setup, but by and large, you do not get people working at with the same drive or motivation or willingness to work. So certainly civil society organizations have a role, but if the bigger picture is to be met, if universal health care is to be achieved within the next 2 generations, then that job needs to be played by government. That's what I was trying to say.
The question is, how do you engage with a government run by people you don't agree with?
A lot of
Now
the
look,
work
these
that we do
people
is
can
about
answer that question better than me.
I know.
these people.
I know.
One retired government servant, these people.
No, but that is what I was going to say.
I know.
No, I was just going to say that those people.
Those people.
Those people or we the people.
I think
but
one
this
thing
question
we
would
learn,
be specifically for
one
Keshav,
thing
I
we
think.
learn in government is that the first thing you do when you join government service is take an oath to the Constitution on day 1. And I think that is the answer to this question, that governments come and governments go. And that is a completely legitimate process. An elected government takes office. You may not have voted for that government, and you may disagree with many things that government is saying, but if they have come through a democratically elected process, then they are occupying a position to which they are entitled. And it is then your responsibility as a functioning civil servant in that system to carry out the work of that government. 2 points to make here. Many things do not change across governments. at least in the old days. I have retired now for 3 years, but certainly through the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, governments came and governments went, but nothing changed on the files in terms of either the way decisions were being made or the quality of those decisions being made. Quite a lot depended on who was the person wielding the pen, but that was the same person across governments. So it was not as though, oh yes, which was the Gujarat government fell and Mr. Vajpayee formed a government and dramatic changes happened, or Mr. Vajpayee's government fell and Dr. Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister and everything changed. No, not at all. Many things were the same. At the level of the ministries and the departments and everything else. And the other point, of course, is that in the history of civil service in India, you can find this. There will be situations when a conscientious civil servant says, "This I cannot do." We are seeing fewer and fewer instances of this, but certainly we have seen this in the past, where people say, "Look, I am bound to the Constitution. I have a duty. This is what I'm telling you." Quite often there would be, "Look, I have told you what I think you should do. Now do what you think," and the orders come, and then that is implemented. There could be situations where, "No, I've told you what I think you should do. You are refusing to do it. I will not permit it." So people are moved. Sometimes some people have even taken the step of resigning from the service and things. Resignation is, one does not join any job or a job in government really. One doesn't join in order to resign. One joins in order to try and do something. That's not easy because, again, things are much more difficult now. I was saying to a friend recently, I was district magistrate 30 years ago. There is no comparison. Young people today who are district magistrates, their life is just hellish. Hellish. There's no other word for it. UP, which is the only state I know, it's the violence which is palpable in every part of your daily life. The people you talk to, the kind of things coming up before you, the things happening on the street in front of you, the demands on you by political leaders of one sort or the other, corruption within your own system. Things were not as bad as this. They were not great, but it was certainly a job that could be done. There was certainly a job where at every level in the service, you could hold your own and get on with it. Certainly my generation of civil servants had many opportunities when you could say to your chief minister or minister, not in public, but go to him in his room and say, "This you can't do." And that was the end of that. It was not done. I believe that situation has changed completely. Those scenarios are gone. It was certainly possible in the old days. I think it was something to do with it was a different time altogether.
Again, Nandini, it's a question for you. Today's discussion was based on the premise that the state, as we define it, stays fixed or stagnant in its methods and systems of operation. Do you think civil society, whatever it may have done, has a role to play, should have a role to play in envisioning and adding to the discourse around post-growth, post-capitalist system of politico-economic governance, rather than only focus on being carriers of the friction or necessary watchdog to the state as it is today?
You understood?
Yeah, I agree with Keshav, just in response to that nothing can match the reach of the state in a sense, and the state is representative insofar as it has followed some kind of due procedure to become the state. So I think there are many ways of working with the government or with the state to be a watchdog, to work providing constructive examples, alternatives. So I don't think there is one form of working with the state or one form of the state. As was Keshav also pointed out, the state itself has become hellish for its own practitioners. And it's also been seeding ground to corporates, like Usha was pointing out. So what we understand as the state to work with may also not be available to work with in the same way. So I don't really have an answer to that because it really depends on what any group finds itself in, the kind of situation or the kind of context a group finds itself in, and what it sees are the possibilities. So sorry, that's not really an answer, but
It's a response.
You have probably stirred a lot of problem with so many people sitting in the audience, because apart from you, I don't think there would be more than a couple of people who don't have cell phones in this hall. But the question is, we have already given up so much of data. Deleting it or getting it back may not be possible. So is regulating it the only way forward?
Actually, I don't know why we are so defeatist. We've not even tried and we've already given up. Nobody else has the right to what, we have a right. It's not about it being our property. It is our right. And if you're going to say, oh, we already gave, so now what to do? So let's give for the rest of our lives, and then for our children's lives, and then forever and ever. It really makes no sense. I think there are certain things that are not okay. And I think that's been the strength of civil society, that never mind what the pressure, never mind how much we may feel like we're going to lose this game, we still play it because we know it's important. We know that certain things are not right, and we are not going to sit by and say, ठीक है क्या करें चलता है. It is not चलता है. And on data and on technology, I think there are always choices. And I'm not talking about the choice of whether you have a cell phone or not. And because I cannot ever say the statement without that undertone of saying, just throw your cell phones away. I'll just say that once. But it's not just about that. It's about recognizing that if we want, see, the question is this, at least to me, it's pretty simple. Do we really value liberty or not? Freedom and liberty. Because somewhere I find we've allowed even our minds to get heavily bureaucratized. You don't have to be in the bureaucracy to get bureaucratized. We've allowed that to happen to us. So, and then we constantly feel a sense of overwhelm. Now, if we feel a sense of overwhelm about protecting our own liberty and freedom, then I don't blame the state for feeling a sense of overwhelm when it has to deal with 1.3 billion people. It's really not okay. So, overwhelm is not an answer to that. If we can see, and we need to learn to see more clearly what the problem is that is emerging in our midst, and we have to address that problem. There is no data that is already out there. Maybe we won't be ever able to delete it totally, but it will get distorted over a period of time if we don't keep giving them more and more. You have no idea how many meetings I go to where I'm introduced saying I teach consumer law in Indian Law Institute. That was in 1997 to 2003. So it moves. So let's not feel so like we can't deal with this. But there is one other thing I want to say about technology. The way technologies are being introduced in India today, apart from the high-end kind of stuff where we are all told, get onto it, it's so exciting, it's brilliant, everyone have one, have two. Apart from that, the way this data collection is happening is on the shoulders of, shooting from the shoulders of the poor. The whole UID project came on the basis that we need it for the poor. The Ayushman Bharat is trying to collect all this data saying we want to give the poor health service. Therefore, all the data should be given. And then they say in their national health stack that India will be the country with the maximum amount of medical information, health information. Like it's a great thing for us to have, which will become a resource on which they are going to build many other systems. This is about information about people. And I don't think, that's where we are headed now, and it's being done because the poor are the easiest to target. If anybody needs any support from the state said, you want my support, you give me what I want. And the state cannot be allowed to bargain like this. People have recorded at least 42 deaths that are relatable in one way or another to the UID. Deaths. So you can imagine the amount of problem that exists behind this. So in terms of technology, for me, actually, it's not a choice for us whether we want to engage with the problems of it or not. We really have no choice. And we tend to give up. Like when the people said you have to link your UID with the bank and with mobile phone, whole hordes of people stood up and said, what are they asking us to do? The moment they said, okay, that's not compulsory, everyone sat back despite deaths happening routinely because of UID linking and biometrics. I don't think that level of insensitivity we can afford. And if that's what technology is also doing, then those parts of technology have to be addressed. There is no choice saying it's already happened, what do we do? That's exactly what people, you know what we've been told? Why do you want privacy? Have convenience instead. Consent is already broken, so your consent is irrelevant. Data is the new oil. So what did oil produce in the last century for us? Many wars. So these are given to us like they are axioms that we cannot question. It's nonsense. These are all axioms that are being conjured up so that we stop asking questions. And I think the best thing about civil society, about people in general, is our ability to raise the question first and follow through on it. I think that's all we need to do, even in technology.
Okay, I think we are almost there. There are two small questions and we'll end with that. Anyone can take that. Don't you think civil society movements are promoted by corporates all over the world to undermine political unrest?
I have a small answer to that, if I may. The rest of it, others will have to say, I don't know. I think one of the really damaging things that happened in our system was the CSR provision in the Companies Act. Something that should have gone as tax to the government, which will then be distributed according to the needs across the country, has got converted into some where the state is saying, I'm not just giving up commercial activities, I'm giving up the activity that I'm supposed to do to ensure that people's basic rights are protected. And I'm handing it over for corporates to do. You set up schools, we'll give you a list of things that we are supposed to do. Now you do it. And if you don't feel like doing any of that, put it into the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. And from all accounts, over 70 to whatever, 75% of the CSR money has just gone into the Prime Minister's Relief Fund. I think that one provision, and this idea that the NGT also keeps saying, no, okay, you put 2% of your profits or 5 crores, whichever is more, for CSR activities in that area, for upliftment of tribals in an area where you're going to take the tribals out of the area. This kind of calculation, this kind of balancing that they do is so damaging that I think this is one move that we need to step back. We have to take back from that CSR thing and put it back into the taxation regime and demand that money be spent on the range of things that they have themselves mentioned other than the Prime Minister's Relief Fund as being what the state should have done, which was getting handed over. The state needs to take it back.
Today's subject was civil society and civil society organizations and its role in policy making and discourse. So the last question is, what in your opinion are the 3 major changes that have shaped governance and society in India initiated by people's action? So we end it on a positive note.
We've done it throughout on a positive note.
1, 2, 3.
I think the land movement has been remarkable. I mean, each of us might have a different view.
So
I think that's been phenomenal. The second, which is not only national but which is also global, is the battle against impunity. And it's not like we've beaten it, but we have questioned it. We've made many things happen because of that. We've definitely moved a long way from where we were on impunity, where the state could do what it wanted and say, I am the state and nobody is going to challenge any of this. I think that has got broken to quite an extent. I think the problem that I have, I'm sorry not to be so positive about it, is that I think corruption is a problem, sure, but I don't think that's our biggest problem. And we have allowed it to swamp too much else. And that I think is dangerous. The RTI movement has been very helpful, but it shouldn't just be treated like it's a corruption issue. And the idea, for instance, that in this country we have, if you take the NHRC reports and you look at the number of deaths in custody that happen, and you see that deaths in custody is so large, if it's death, you can imagine the amount of torture. It's like so common. And somewhere I feel that it's because torture hasn't hit us yet, that we haven't realized how horrible and how horrific it is. I think there are all those elements of impunity around us which are systemically dragging us down from being any kind of rule of law society. When I say rule of law, I don't mean rule of law so that we all live by the law. I mean rule of law so that the state abides by the law. And we need to bring that.
Nandini?
Mic is not on.
I think the biggest contribution has been to make the public and the state realize that it is not the sole repository of expertise and knowledge. And so in a variety of fields, I think the biggest contribution has been for people through their various alternatives, through their questioning of state policies, to show that there are multiple sources of knowledge which the state must take into account. Whether or not they do that, I think if they don't do that, it's not because they don't know that there is something that needs to be addressed, but because political economy of the state forces them to act in a different way. But the knowledge-giving functions of civil society have been critical.
Issue?
All I can just think of, just to add to what Nandini was just saying, there are several instances of very progressive legislation that have come through either initial demands by civil society organizations, sometimes rooted through the courts and court orders as well. This is, if you look back at the history of how legislation has been framed in India, this is a huge change. Really till well into the, well, I think pretty much till, well, for the first 40 years after independence, the drafting of legislation was an entirely in-house business within government ministries and departments, and whatever information, knowledge was there was regarded as it, and that was all there was to it. That has changed, and Usha, of course, knows much more about this than I do, but some of the things that I'm familiar with, that has made a very big difference to the way, both to the involvement of the people in what are very, very important processes, and a recognition that if you look at any legislation, well, again, I'm not absolutely sure about the present government, but certainly till the last government, every legislation drafted by every ministry was on the ministry's website for comments. Every legislation that went to the parliamentary standing committees were publicly advertised, and the parliamentary standing committees would pay travel costs of people to come and give evidence. So those processes, I think, were important. It's a silent process that goes on in the background, but I think it's a very important way in which people and special interest groups have, I mean, if you go back and look at the debates on the new Persons with Disabilities Act and the new Mental Health Care Act, the intense public debate that went into those, it's an example of what can be done.
Thank you. Thank you all the three panelists, Keshav, Usha and Nandini. I think it was a very nice debate to have, and I think we are all in the 25th year when we are looking at these issues and we are reflecting onto our own role as a civil society organization. We take a lot back. Thank you.